Your kind isn't welcome here. Too disruptive, the restaurant manager sneered, gesturing toward the door. Eleanor Ellie Thompson, a 68-year-old deaf Vietnam veteran, sat silently, her untouched soup cooling before her. She hadn't made a sound, hadn't caused a ripple, just sat quietly observing the restaurant while occasionally jotting notes in her small notebook. Disruptive? Ellie finally wrote, sliding her notebook across the table, her weathered hands steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. I haven't even finished my appetizer. The manager just pointed toward the exit. Out before I call security to remove you. The next afternoon, as the silver spoon prepared for its dinner service, the front door opened, and in walked not one but 12 imposing figures, all with the same unmistakable military bearing as Ellie, all wearing Vietnam veteran caps, all with faces that had seen too much war. If you believe respect transcends all disabilities, type honor below. Eleanor Thompson was searching for her place in a world that felt impossibly loud after 40 years of silence. She had served as a nurse in Vietnam, one of the few women closest to front lines, until a nearby explosion took her hearing and damaged her vocal cords during her second tour. At 23, she returned home to a country that neither understood her sacrifice nor her newfound disability. She learned to navigate life in silence, mastering sign language, reading lips, and carrying a small notebook wherever she went. Her disability pension provided enough for basic needs, but the emotional scars ran deeper than her physical ones. The transition had been more jarring than any medevac flight. Now at 68, with silver hair cut in a practical bob and perpetually alert eyes, Ellie had finally decided to revisit the coastal town of Harbor Springs, where she spent her childhood summers before the war changed everything. She was staying in a modest room at the Shoreline Inn, the salt air bringing back memories of simpler times. She didn't look like what people expected of a Vietnam vet. She was petite, with a slight stoop to her shoulders, dressed in practical slacks, sensible shoes, and a faded navy cardigan with a small Vietnam service pin on the lapel. Her hearing aids were discreet, though they only offered minimal help for her profound hearing loss. Ellie wasn't looking for trouble or attention. She was just looking for a moment of normalcy, a quiet place to enjoy a meal and feel part of the world again, if only for an hour. She carried a dignity earned through decades of overcoming obstacles most people couldn't imagine, navigating a world designed for the hearing while battling the isolation that came with her disability. The Silver Spoon restaurant occupied prime real estate on Harbor Springs' renovated waterfront. With its polished brass fixtures, white tablecloths, and expansive windows overlooking the marina, it catered to wealthy tourists and locals who appreciated its pretentious menu and inflated prices. The restaurant's nautical-themed interior struck an awkward balance between maritime authenticity and upscale dining. Gregory Walsh, the 45-year-old manager, had taken over operations 5 years ago with the single-minded goal of elevating the Silver Spoon status. Perpetually dressed in tailored suits that strained slightly at the buttons, he maintained a veneer of sophistication that barely concealed his fundamental insecurities about belonging in high society. Walsh prided himself on creating an atmosphere of refinement, which in practice meant arbitrary enforcement of unwritten rules based on his perception of suitable clientele. He was particularly intolerant of anyone who might disturb what he called the dining experience. In his mind, this included families with young children, people with visible disabilities, and anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of elegance. His prejudice against disabled patrons stemmed from a deeply misguided belief that their presence made other customers uncomfortable. He'd once bragged to his staff about discouraging undesirable elements to maintain the restaurant's image, a phrase that encompassed more about his character than he realized. When Ellie Thompson walked in, requesting a table with a handwritten note and pointing to her ear before making the universal sign for deaf, Walsh's expression had immediately soured. He seated her only reluctantly at a corner table partially hidden behind a decorative column. Ellie had been sitting quietly for about 30 minutes, savoring her seafood bisque and watching boats drift past the window when Walsh decided she had to go. He approached her table, standing over her with arms crossed, his expression already hostile. "Ma'am," he began loudly and unnecessarily slow, as if volume and exaggeration would somehow penetrate her deafness. "Is there something wrong with your soup?" You've been staring out the window and writing in that notebook for half an hour. Ellie glanced up, surprised. She read his lips, then politely took her notebook and wrote, "Everything is fine. Thank you. Just enjoying the view and my meal." Walsh frowned at the note. "Well, you're taking up a premium table during our pre-dinner rush. People are waiting." Ellie looked around pointedly at the half-empty restaurant before writing, "I've ordered a full meal. The entree hasn't arrived yet." "About that," Walsh said, not bothering to hide his disdain. "We're having kitchen issues. Your order might be delayed significantly. Perhaps another restaurant would better accommodate your special needs." Ellie's eyes narrowed slightly. She wrote, "I'm perfectly comfortable waiting. What special needs do you mean?" Walsh leaned in, lowering his voice though Ellie couldn't hear him anyway. "Look, your constant note writing and signing is distracting other guests. The silver spoon isn't really equipped for people with your condition." Ellie straightened her back, the old military bearing resurfacing as she wrote firmly, "My condition is deafness. I'm a paying customer causing no disruption." Walsh's face hardened. "Your kind isn't welcome here. Too disruptive. This is a sophisticated establishment, not a charity service. We don't have staff to cater to handicapped people." The word handicapped, written so dismissively, stung like a physical blow. Ellie had faced discrimination for decades, but it never hurt less. She wrote one final note. "I've served this country as a combat nurse. I'm entitled to the same respect as any customer." Walsh scoffed. "Sure you did. Look, finish your soup and leave. Or don't finish it. Just take your business elsewhere." Ellie stood slowly, her dignified posture a stark contrast to Walsh's sneering condescension. She placed a $20 bill beside her half-eaten soup, far more than it was worth, and walked toward the exit with measured steps. Though her face remained composed, decades of military discipline prevented her from showing the humiliation burning within. Outside, she paused at the marina railing, the fading afternoon light gilding the water. The injustice coiled in her stomach, bitter as military-issue medicine. After all she'd sacrificed, her hearing, her voice, years of her life in service, to be dismissed so casually based on prejudice was a pain that cut deeper than any physical wound. Ellie pulled out her smartphone, the one concession to modern technology she truly valued. She opened a specialized messaging app designed for deaf users, connecting her to her old Vietnam platoon. Many had learned basic signing to communicate with her after her injury. They'd kept in touch through the decades, a bond forged in combat that civilians could never fully understand. She typed a brief message to Lieutenant Colonel James Buck Franklin, their former platoon leader. Silver Spoon Restaurant, Harbor Springs. Manager Gregory Walsh. Ejected for being deaf. Hostile to veterans and disabled. Ellie, she hit send, expecting nothing but sharing the burden. The following afternoon, 3 sedans pulled up with military precision outside the Silver Spoon. They parked in formation, not randomly like civilian vehicles, but with deliberate spacing and positioning that suggested habit rather than coincidence. Lieutenant Colonel James Buck Franklin, now 72 but still ramrod straight despite titanium hips, emerged from the lead car. His white hair was cropped in the same military cut he'd worn for 5 decades, his weathered face bearing the dignified creases of a man who had let others through hell and brought them back. He wore pressed khakis, a button-down shirt, and a Vietnam veteran cap adorned with service medals. From the other vehicles emerged 11 men and women. Ellie's platoon, her brothers and sisters in arms. Most were in their late 60s or early 70s now, their bodies showing wear of age and old injuries, but they moved with purpose. Some used canes, one was in a wheelchair, but each carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of soldiers. They had come from 3 different states, dropping everything after receiving Buck's group message about Ellie. "Everyone clear on the mission parameters?" Buck asked, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority that had once commanded respect in combat zones. They nodded. No one needed to speak. They'd run countless missions together in far more dangerous situations than this. Sandra Doc Mitchell, their former medic, now with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering, passed out small cards. Basic ASL phrases, she explained. For Ellie, each veteran took a moment to practice the signs. They hadn't come for confrontation. They'd seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. They'd come for something more important, to stand for one of their own when the world refused to see her value. Delta formation, Buck said simply, and they moved toward the restaurant with a synchronized precision of people who had once trusted each other with their lives. Gregory Walsh was instructing his host on proper wine presentation when he noticed the first elderly couple entering the Silver Spoon. Nothing seemed unusual until they were followed by another, then another, until the entire entryway filled with seniors, all wearing Vietnam veteran caps, all moving with the same quiet deliberation. They didn't request tables. They simply stood in formation, filling the reception area and spilling into the dining room, where conversations faltered as customers sensed a shift in atmosphere. These weren't ordinary seniors out for an early bird special. They carried themselves with the weight of authority that needed no announcement. Walsh swallowed hard, a prickle of unease traveling up his spine as he approached the group. "Good afternoon," he managed, his customer service smile strained. "Do you have a reservation? We're quite busy today." Buck Franklin stepped forward, his gaze level and unflinching. He didn't need to raise his voice. Decades of command presence allowed him to speak softly while still being the loudest person in the room. "You must be Gregory Walsh," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. "I am," Walsh confirmed, his eyes darting between the assembled veterans. Behind them, the hostess was frantically flipping to the reservation book as if hoping to find a group booking for intimidating Vietnam veterans, party of 12. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel James Franklin. Yesterday, you had the poor judgment to eject Eleanor Thompson from your establishment." The veterans didn't move, didn't shift, just maintained their positions like an honor guard. One woman in a wheelchair positioned herself by the entrance, effectively controlling access. Another veteran with a cane casually moved to stand near the kitchen doors. The others spread throughout the dining area, not blocking movement, but establishing an unmistakable presence. Buck nodded toward a man who opened the door, and in walked Ellie Thompson, her back straight, her eyes clear. She took her place beside Buck, facing Walsh directly. The veterans simultaneously raised their hands and signed a simple phrase Ellie had taught them decades ago in Vietnam. "We stand together." In the sudden silence, a fork clattered against a plate. A waiter froze mid-step, water pitcher suspended in air. Regular diners exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing they were witnessing something significant beyond their understanding. Walsh's face drained of color as he realized these weren't just elderly veterans. This was a coordinated unit that had once operated in war zones, and they had just deployed to his restaurant with military efficiency. "Mr. Walsh," Buck continued, his voice carrying the weight of command without raising its volume. "We understand you have a misunderstanding regarding the value of certain customers." Walsh glanced nervously around the dining room, where regular patrons were watching with undisguised interest. There was no misunderstanding. We were simply unable to accommodate. "Let me stop you there," Buck interrupted calmly. Eleanor Thompson served as a combat nurse with the 71st Evac Hospital. She lost her hearing pulling wounded soldiers to safety after a mortar attack. She's dined in establishments across 4 continents without incident until she encountered your particular brand of hospitality. A veteran named Marcus, leaning on his cane, added, "Ellie saved my life when I took shrapnel outside Da Nang. She deserves better than being thrown out like garbage." Walsh shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I support veterans. My uncle was in the service. If there was a communication issue..." "The only communication issue," Buck said, "was your failure to recognize the difference between disability and worth. But we're here to help educate you." Doc Mitchell stepped forward, placing a folder on the hostess stand. "Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Walsh. First, you'll personally apologize to Ellie, in writing, since that's how she communicates best. Second, your staff will receive basic training in accommodating deaf patrons." She tapped the folder. "I brought materials from the National Association of the Deaf." Buck added, "Third, the Silver Spoon will make a meaningful donation to the Wounded Warriors Project in Eleanor's name." Walsh's face hardened. "And if I refuse?" "We won't cause a scene," Buck said reasonably. "We're beyond the age for that. Instead, we'll simply dine here. Every day, all of us, at separate tables. For hours, ordering only coffee. For weeks, or however long it takes for your regular customers to realize that the Silver Spoon has become the unofficial meeting place for Vietnam veterans in Harbor Springs." The restaurant had fallen completely silent, every patron watching the scene unfold. Walsh looked from Buck to Ellie, then at the other veterans positioned strategically throughout his restaurant. He recognized the feat when he saw it. 20 minutes later, Gregory Walsh sat across from Ellie Thompson at the restaurant's best table, the one with an unobstructed view of the harbor. Between them lay a handwritten note, composed after 3 discarded attempts. "Ms. Thompson, I offer my sincere apology for my inexcusable behavior yesterday. My actions reflected prejudice, not principle. Your service deserves honor, not discrimination. The Silver Spoon welcomes you anytime as our distinguished guest. With deepest regrets, Gregory Walsh." Ellie read it carefully, then nodded once, a clipped, military acknowledgement rather than forgiveness. She wrote beneath his words, "Accepted. Now prove it's genuine through actions, not just words." Meanwhile, Doc Mitchell was conducting an impromptu training session with the waitstaff, demonstrating basic signs for "thank you," "excuse me," and "check, please." The younger servers, embarrassed by their manager's behavior, were practicing enthusiastically. In the office, Buck Franklin was having a quiet conversation with Walsh about the appropriate figure for a donation, a conversation that caused Walsh's complexion to pale considerably. The other veterans had dispersed the tables throughout the restaurant, ordering full meals with multiple courses, leaving generous tips, and behaving with impeccable courtesy that made Walsh's earlier accusations seem even more shameful. By evening's end, the Silver Spoon had not only guaranteed Ellie a standing reservation whenever she wished it, but had also committed to hosting a monthly dinner for local disabled veterans, with sign language interpreters present. Buck had accomplished his mission with the same efficiency he once commanded in combat, without firing a shot. The changes at the Silver Spoon happened swiftly. Within a week, the restaurant displayed a new sign. "We proudly accommodate all patrons, including those with disabilities. Please let us know how we can serve you better." Walsh, under the watchful eyes of Harbor Springs' tight-knit community and occasional check-in visits from members of Ellie's platoon, kept his word. The staff received proper training, simple picture menus were created, and the restaurant became unexpectedly popular with a previously untapped clientele. Elderly veterans and disabled patrons who had money to spend but had avoided establishments where they didn't feel welcome. The story spread through Harbor Springs, then across veteran networks nationwide. The Silver Spoon's substantial donation to the Wounded Warriors Project made local news, though reports tactfully omitted the circumstances that prompted it. Walsh learned that accommodating disabled patrons wasn't the burden he'd imagined. In fact, it was good business. More importantly, he began to recognize the invisible weight many of his patrons carried. Not just physical disabilities, but experiences and sacrifices beyond his comprehension. Sometimes respect is taught through confrontation, sometimes through example. For Gregory Walsh, it took both, and the silent, dignified testimony of 12 veterans who refused to leave one of their own behind. 2 months later, Ellie dined at the Silver Spoon one final time before returned to her home in Virginia. Walsh himself served her, awkwardly fingerspelling WLCOME with unpracticed hands. Ellie smiled, not the forced politeness of the marginalized, but the genuine appreciation of someone finally being seen. She was seated at her preferred table by the window when 3 elderly couples entered. Part of her platoon who had relocated to Harbor Springs after retirement. They joined her without fanfare, communicating in a mix of sign language, written notes, and the occasional spoken word for those who could still hear. Walsh watched them from across the restaurant. These aged warriors whose bodies bore the marks of a war fought before he was born, yet who still moved with purpose and dignity. They weren't just customers anymore. They were a living reminder that respect isn't granted by position or authority, but earned through character and deeds. The bonds formed in combat never truly break. When one veteran is disrespected, an entire platoon feels the sting. And sometimes, the most powerful statements are made not through confrontation, but through solidarity that needs no words. Have you ever witnessed someone standing up for a person with disabilities? Or perhaps you've been the one to take a stand. Share your stories of respect in the comments below. What would you have done in Ellie's position or in her platoon's? Because true respect transcends age, ability, and circumstance. And sometimes, the quietest voice in the room deserves the loudest support.